Okay, let me figure out how to share my screen. Give me just a second here. And this one. That should work. Okay, everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Give me just a second here. Okay, great. Oops, hang on. Please hate how this works. Okay, good. I'm here because, or I'm talking about this topic, because a couple of months ago we had a presentation in this group where one of the things that was pointed out was, well, you should all really understand more about costs and finance. And it's something I've always been involved in, but I realized it's probably something worth talking about, particularly in the current environment. And a good topic for the end of the year as we start thinking about what we're going to do next year. So I'd like to start with a story because I think this will tell you a little bit about where my interest comes from and maybe a little bit about where I come from. And that is, this is early in my career, really in my first job. I had just been installing systems around the world for the bank that I worked for, had come back. At the time I was living in New York, joined a new division there. We built out new systems, deployed them to our first customers. And I remember after one of our first successful rollouts to a new customer or onboarding of a new customer, we got together for the celebration, and the head of this division, who was a fairly young banker, really aggressive, really nice guy. I liked working for him as the head of our business. And one of the things he said always stuck with me, and that was that, well, you know, our customers love the fact that we have this great technology and it does all these amazing things for us. But in the end, if we can deliver the same results by having a million cats walk across a million keyboards and randomly generate the same information, and we can sell it for the same amount of money, the customers will be just as happy. And that has always stuck with me. Because it's a reminder that, yes, we work on really cool stuff. We do great things with technology. But in the end, it's about a business. It's about customers getting value. And for customers to get value, we have to sometimes, at least, well, most of the times, address the cost side of the equation as well. So that's a bit of where I come from. A little bit more about me. I recently left AWS, where I was a tech program manager. In my first couple of roles there, I did a lot with cost control and infrastructure management. Later did some other things that I wasn't quite as happy with and left recently. I'm now looking for something new. Previously, I was a consultant. I was a software development manager, did some tech strategy and consulting. And in the deep past, I was an actual engineer, and people paid me to write code, which nobody in their right mind would do today. I hope. I have an overall framework for thinking about costs, and I start by recognizing that there are two big buckets to everything we do, and they are infrastructure and people. There's been a lot of focus this year on infrastructure. I've seen that a lot with the development of the of what's now being referred to as FinOps. Uh, and then there's the people side. And we've heard a lot about the people side as well, mostly in terms of productivity. And I'll have some comments about productivity at the end. One of my biggest takeaways from many years of experience is you can't treat either of these in isolation. And I'll get to this when I talk about anti-patterns. There are also 5 dimensions to consider when you're talking about costs. First is the overall scale of the business. Then there are strategic and organizational decisions. There's the management processes in place. Today, those are called FinOps. I like to talk about FinOps plus. FinOps usually refers mostly to the infrastructure and mostly the cloud infrastructure side of things. As I said, I like to think about the people as well. So FinOps plus includes that. You have to look at cost from an architectural point of view. Remember Conway's law, infrastructure and people, code structure and or code architecture and the organization of your people will tend to align to each other. And they will, changing one impacts the other and can change your costs in unpredictable ways. And then finally, there are the operational and tactical things. These are things that particularly as SDMs we deal with all the time, which is, are we getting the best utilization from our resources? Are we using the right ones? These are things that maybe don't need as much upper management involvement. But we're all impacted by, and in most organizations can have some impact on all of these. How high up you can get into the overall scale and strategic issues kind of depends on the size of the organization. Anti-patterns. Why talk about anti-patterns? Well, there are a lot of good ideas, and many of them are treated as far too generic. There are a lot of people throwing out ideas that work in one place, typically one of the big tech companies, as if everybody should do them. I think that's wrong. So what are the good ideas? That tends to be very organization specific. There are also a lot of bad ones, obviously. And avoiding those really big mistakes, in my experience, gets you a good amount of value, just not doing the wrong things. And the wrong things tend to be a lot less company specific. So there's a lot more that I can talk about that will be generic in discussing anti-patterns rather than what are the 3 things you should do now, because the 3 things you should do now will be very situational. And besides, it's a lot easier to talk about what you shouldn't do than actually give you useful advice. If you want useful advice, I'm available. Let me know. So just diving in, the first anti-pattern, and I alluded to this just a minute ago, and that's not understanding the impact of scale. There was a great video recently, and I link to it later in the presentation. I'll point it out with, I think it was Jean Yang basically saying, hey, remember, you're not Google. And this is really important because I used to work with a lot of smaller clients, and they'd come to me and say, hey, I want to send 10, I've heard you can save me 10% on my cloud bill. I'd love to do that. And I look at what they are, and they're spending $100,000 a year on the cloud. Well, the amount of work that I would have to do to save them 10% would cost them more than they're spending. So scale matters. If you don't have a lot of scale, talking about cost management may be the wrong thing. It might be more like, as I said in this Twitter thread a long time ago, I've had a lot of interesting projects with smaller clients, but it was because they were doing really interesting, cool things, not because they were trying to be the most cost efficient players in their space. So big organization, like my first org at AWS, where we had $100 million a year in capital spend that I was responsible for. Well, I could continue finding 1 to 2% improvements there almost indefinitely. And we had a team of 5 people to do it and could justify that. Small organization, you can't justify that amount of effort. So don't try to imitate someone whose scale is just completely different from your own. Number 2, if you ever have the opportunity to design something from the ground up, and a lot of us never really get the opportunity to be true greenfield, but there are a lot of projects and programs where we'll get to design something fairly isolated, and you shouldn't waste it. You should not miss thinking about all of those dimensions of cost that I mentioned earlier when you can. What I've found very often is you'll dive right into what are the business requirements, you'll dive right into what are the technical requirements, and then somewhere in some appendix to some design doc that nobody ever reads, there'll be some vague discussion of best practices in cost management or infrastructure efficiency that will be thrown in at the last minute, and you're really missing an opportunity. Choices made early can have long-lasting impact. And remember, that choice also impacts what your staffing model is going to look like for a long time. So not designing it in, big thing not to do. 3 is missing the people impact. As I said, I called out people. I mentioned Conway's Law. Every decision you make will impact people and people cost. What's your cloud strategy? What tools you use? What metrics you choose? How you're going to optimize will impact your people and the cost of your people. In a couple of slides, I'll talk about cloud strategy, where multiple people I've talked to in that space call it out explicitly. Depending on the choices you make, well, you may have very different staffing models. Might be cheaper, might be more expensive, and might move in opposite directions as the underlying infrastructure costs that you're trying to manage. So consider it. There's an inherent conflict with standards. This is 4th anti-pattern. And that is that standards are generally good, but experimentation is also good. And very often there's no explicit decision about what makes sense to standardize and where you will allow experimentation. Experimentation is where you will get new savings. Standardization is where you will institutionalize existing savings or existing cost structures. Both have their benefits. The typical pattern I see is that standards get set and are never questioned for years, which is why I called this out as over-standardization. But the more generic problem is nobody explicitly deciding what are we going to standardize, what are we going to define as processes that should not change, and where will we allow people to experiment. And I've worked for companies at both extremes. AWS is one extreme where teams really own everything, including how much they experiment. But most teams have their own P&Ls and live and die by those. So that's their way of doing it. About a year and a half ago, I took some time off from AWS. I tried working someplace else briefly. And at this particular fintech, everything was standardized, but it was impossible to experiment with new ways of doing things that I think would have saved a lot of money. And I spent a few months there, and for that reason and a bunch of other things, I decided I'll go back to AWS. They also chose a horribly inefficient language, which, believe it or not, can matter. And it's been quantified how much it can matter. Big one I've seen is, and particularly in the past couple of years, as we've very rapidly moved from we can spend all the money we want to we really have to control costs, is a lot of organizations have decided, oh, we're going to cut 20%, we're going to cut 15%. Everybody's going to cut the same thing. Usually where this happens, it is reflective of the fact that nobody knows where the costs really are generated. If there was good information about where the costs were, you probably wouldn't do that. And that's for a bunch of reasons. The Duckbill Group, who are one of the, I won't say leading, but certainly one of the loudest AWS cost consulting organizations, point out that there's always a variability in larger organizations. So targeting the same kind of cost cuts everywhere usually doesn't work. And I would push back against that if I ever encountered it again. The worst thing about it is it punishes teams that are doing the right thing. Because if you're the team who has been truly optimizing your costs really well for a long time, and now you're told, oh, cut 20%. Whereas the team down the hall who have a huge amount of excess capacity, well, it's easy for them to cut 20%. They haven't cut anything in years. They've been goofing off and running lots of servers they don't need to and storing data that doesn't matter. Easy for them. You did the right thing. Now you're being punished. So it also encourages bad choices. We all game metrics. If we start realizing that, oh, we're going to get these big cost-cutting programs, everyone do 10, everybody do 15, we're all just going to start padding our budgets so that we have room to cut. And that's not a desirable place to be. I'll talk a bit more about metrics soon. Bad cloud strategy. This one's huge. We are continuing to move to the cloud. And not only are we continuing to move to the cloud, but we're moving to what some people would say more cloudiness, which is to say that we're moving from using the cloud as a data center to using a lot of the higher level services that the cloud gives us, a lot of the managements or the managed services that the cloud gives us. And getting the strategy right matters. This is one of the big places where people and technology intersect in weird ways. Those of you who are familiar with DHH, David Heinemeier Hansen, he's Well, he likes being a contrarian. And those of you who followed it, he's made a big deal about the fact that he's getting off the cloud. It's a horrible place to be. I could say a lot about him. In fact, I could talk about him for about 45 minutes. That's not my intent here. But Forrest Brazil came up with this great graphic as part of a response to him, where he pointed out that, well, there are places where the cloud makes sense. There are places where it doesn't. And there are places that you probably need some help, but maybe should become more cloudy as appropriate or as you can. And the one thing he pointed out was he drew this great graphic that I've got on this slide here. The one thing he said is, if you're listening to DHH, you're listening to somebody who is in that very rarefied lower left corner of this chart, where you're a low growth legacy company who, due to the quirky nature of the founder and his ability to attract some very experienced people who just really want to work with him, he's managed to have a staff that really can do all this stuff on their own and don't need or benefit from managed server services. That's unusual. The bottom right quadrant is something like Netflix 10 years ago, where they were just going out and doing crazy stuff. Yes, they used AWS, but they also did amazing things on their own, with high competence, high growth, and the highest salaries in the industry. Again, which of these quadrants you fit into will affect your people costs as well as your infrastructure costs. And then there are the more normal businesses that many of us encounter. It was a good article, worth reading. I won't give the whole thing up, but getting it wrong will get your costs to a place where it's very difficult to recover. Years ago, everybody ran the cloud as a data center. And I worked for, again, a fintech not long ago who were still doing that. And it was killing them. And I still don't think they've gotten themselves out of that, because they built so much custom internal stuff that was predicated on the notion of we're just using AWS as a data center, that I don't think they could easily or quickly move away from it. And that is punishing them to this day. I know that. There's no such thing as cloud neutrality. There was a great presentation in the DevOps meetup a couple months ago about somebody just trying to move a cluster from, I think it was from AWS to Google Cloud, and how much it took just to reconfigure everything to work from a supposedly generic product, Kubernetes, from one place to another. So don't think that one big mistake I see, including this company I worked for not long ago, is well, we don't want to be tied to one cloud, so we're just going to use generic stuff. Nothing's generic. And by the way, it's not generic if you run it in-house either, so keep that in mind. And once again, remember, you are not Google. There's a link here to a pretty good video about that. Cost management as standalone. This is really popular in engineering organizations because, let's be real, nobody wants to do this. We all want to be building things. So we'll set up a team to do cost management, or these days they're calling them FinOps teams, and make them responsible for reducing everybody's costs or controlling everybody's costs. This goes against one of the key principles of DevOps that really works well, and that is aligning authority and responsibility. It is typically correct and normal to have a separate team to report on and audit what the spend actually is, but they have neither the authority nor the responsibility for reducing or controlling those costs, just for making sure that everything is visible and transparent. Somebody else can't be accountable for your costs. And a common mistake is to assume that you can just give it to somebody else. This was the role I was given when I left AWS. It was, oh, you're going to come in and you're going to solve all our cost problems for us. And well, I could come in and write a nice report telling them what the cost problems were. But when it came to actually getting things done, turns out that without the CTO's full and full-time backing against all his other direct reports, that's not going to happen. So don't think you can just hire someone or a team and they'll get it done for you. Authority and responsibility have to be better aligned. Metrics. I talked about this a little bit earlier too. No metrics are bad metrics. Well, no metrics is obviously a problem, but I think bad metrics are an even more insidious problem. And that's because of Goodhart's law. For those of you who don't know it, it basically says that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a useful measure because everybody's going to game it. And we in tech are really, really good at numbers and therefore at gaming numbers. I have seen this over and over again. Either you'll try to make someone else the owner of your costs, or you will pad your costs, or you will. I saw one team not long ago who realized that somebody decided that they're going to be looking at their daily spend, which included a whole lot of noise in the data because it was just a naturally noisy business. So they managed to justify keeping a whole bunch of extra resources available, and they would add or reduce that pile on a daily basis just to keep everything stable, because they realized that, well, the measurements being used would flag them for noise in the data, for 1 to 2% ups and downs on a daily basis. And so they spent a lot of time and effort controlling for the noise in the data rather than doing something useful. You have to be careful about purely informational metrics. And I have a link to an article about this towards the end. I'll share all of that when I'm done. Because even informational metrics that you're not setting targets on will focus people on the wrong things. They say you can't manage what you don't measure. I say you generally don't measure what you don't want to manage. So the very fact that a metric is being captured communicates to your organization that this is something that matters and you should care about it. Now, I find that a lot of those metrics are essential to review, to periodically understand the state of the business, and to look for anomalies, to look for developing trends that you haven't really been trying to manage for, but maybe you want to in the future. And it's important to present those as such to the organization. In my old org at AWS, we used to talk about dogs not barking. And it was very clear that, yeah, we're capturing all these metrics because we want to be looking for dogs not barking, the problems that are slowly growing in the background that we're not thinking about, that, excuse me, that eventually we will have to. Beyond that, with costing, the metric is generally obvious. It's dollars, but in the end, it's always dollars per something, per unit of output, per something you are doing. And very often it's not so much the dollars that it is as it is that other thing you're measuring, where metrics get really bad. I speak about this a little bit later, but data is one of the places where it's really hard sometimes to quantify what you're measuring. You're measuring storage, you're measuring access, you're measuring database performance, and who owns all of this. It gets to be difficult. General advice, this is true for OKRs everywhere. Best if the people working on the problem get to determine the targets. One of the subtle points about OKRs that is often unstated is that the O part of the OKR is a management decision. The KR part needs to be worked out with the team that's going to do the work. Otherwise, the targets really do become self-defeating. Oh, number 9, a tool will save us. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen places with Datadog or, heaven help us, Snowflake at massive cost and didn't know what to do with it. Reminder, new tools cost money. They require additional staffing to support often very expensive people. They may disrupt the way you're doing things now, and they may have downstream impacts on other things you're doing. Really, before you think a tool will solve cost problems, understand what that tool is really going to give you and what it's going to cost to get it in place and to operate it over the long term. The tool salespeople will not tell you that part. And that includes the ones from the big cloud providers. They want you to use their cost management tools as well. They won't tell you the downsides. Make sure you understand them. Attribution is a huge problem, and it's usually a legacy problem. Most organizations I see that are starting up today are pretty well set up to capture and manage costs. A decade ago, that wasn't true. A decade ago, AWS were basically recommending you should use one account for your whole organization, and didn't even really have great cross-account support. I think Azure at the time didn't have cross-account support at all. It's taken a while for everything to be able to be tagged easily. That's meant that companies that have been around for a decade or so on some of these platforms are kind of in trouble because it's hard to add it later. There are technical issues. There are especially political issues sometimes. A minute ago, I was talking about data, and data ownership is always tricky. It can be a strategic issue where you have shared data. Who owns it? Who owns the cost of keeping it? I know one company where a huge amount of data was being kept indefinitely because the founder, and Andrew, thank you for the comment. I'll address it as we go along. But the founder had decided we're going to keep all data indefinitely. Well, So who owns the cost of keeping that data? None of the teams really want it. There's no indication that the customers really care that they can get 10 years of data as opposed to just the past 18 months. If you were being honest, there would be a big bucket of costs for data that we're storing because the founder wants it, and it would come out of the founder's stock holdings every quarter. But that's not the reality of how organizations work. So very often the negotiations over data, especially data that's maintained in clusters or data that's maintained in databases, where you have the cost of storage plus the cost of transactions. There's probably the cost of creating and then ingesting it. That can get very tricky and very political, but you need to figure it out. It will never be perfect. A model is at best imperfect, but there needs to be something, and you need to be able to attribute it, even through multiple layers of, in some cases I've seen where you have to track from hardware through other infrastructure to internal platforms, intermediate services, databases, and then eventually it all filters out to products and services that somebody pays to use. And how do you assign all those costs to customer click the button? It's a lot easier if you do it right from the start, or at least try to do it right from the start. But at some point, it has to be done. From what I've seen, companies that are trying to move towards more organized and mature FinOps really struggle with this one. It's not as simple as just tagging your resources, although that helps, and it's a huge part of it. There. Sub-optimization. We do this all the time. And this is another place where the wrong metrics really, really drive bad decisions, because you'll optimize individual services at the expense of other individual services if that's what the metrics you're measured on tell you to do. You'll sometimes end up with duplication of effort and data. I don't want to own the cost of the data, so I'm going to push data storage onto my customers. Except that my customers now will each take my data and replicate it into their own data stores. So now there's similar data being stored all over the company at a much higher cost than a single smartly organized data store that people shared. Again, what are the metrics that are driving that? What are the OKRs that are driving that? What are the strategic choices that are driving that? There's always a conflict between doing what's right for the company versus what's doing right for the team. As with other things, make the choices explicit. There's no right or wrong. And one of the things people often get bogged down into in all of these discussions, this goes for the previous slide as well, is what is the right way to do it? And the better question is, what is the way to do it that will be simple, easy to manage, and drive the company in the right direction? A story not specifically related to tech costs, but a company I worked for a long time ago hired a new CFO who decided to optimize their salespeople's commission schedules, which from his perspective were a cost. It's how much is he paying for every sale. He came up with a model that was so complex that the salespeople couldn't understand it. The result was that all around the company, people were passing around spreadsheets, all of which were wrong, to try to figure out what a salesperson might earn in commission on any given type of deal and what their next paycheck would look like. They literally could not figure it out. That didn't help optimize things for the company. It optimized, must have been a pricing compensation model devised by Larry Ellison. Funny you should mention that. This CFO had worked for Oracle. And yes, and feel free to jump in if you have comments like that. I don't mind. I'm just sort of staring at a screen. I can't see anybody's faces because of how Zoom works. So feel free to jump in. But yeah, he had worked for Oracle and he was looking for the perfect commission structure to make sure that he was perfect. Ooh, that wasn't good. To make sure that he was perfectly compensating people. But as with any other incentive plan, and the metrics we live and die by are perhaps less directly, but they are an incentive for us to do our jobs right. If we don't understand them, it doesn't matter how perfect they are. So don't think about what is the perfect metric and try to perfectly optimize. Figure out what can work. And a good example, as I said a minute ago, who owns and pays for shared data? That's always a tough nut to crack. Okay. 12th point, and we've got two more after this. There's no ongoing review of utilization and spend. A FinOps team helps, but it needs to be done at the tactical level as well within the engineering teams, usually, as I said, with an outside team who are experts at getting the right information and making it consistent across the organization. No huge secrets there. You want to look for anomalies. They'll tend to show themselves quickly if you're looking at the right things. The other thing that has to happen within, and this is within the engineering teams, is not regularly reviewing what are your choices. Depending on the environment you're in, there may be new instance types. There may be new storage capabilities and categories. You may be able to minimize data transfer fees. There may just be opportunities to make things more predictable. You can better identify things that can be shut off. There may be new tools to eliminate work. Languages. Some companies define this centrally. Others, like where I worked recently, let you do your own thing. But depending on how compute intensive your work is, languages, and I've got an appendix on this as well, can make a huge difference. And they can especially make a difference on mobile, where language differences can have a huge impact on both memory use, which will incredibly slow down a device like this, and battery life. So that's something that, if you can, you should be reviewing within your team or within your engineering org from time to time, not always. Not something you want to do on a week-by-week basis. And then finally, this one comes up a lot. I hear people saying there should be rewards programs for cost cutting. I sat through the cost management course offered by the people at A Cloud Guru, which used to be a great way to learn about some of the cloud services until they were bought by Pluralsight and started putting out things like their AWS cost control course, where they actually highlight you should have rewards programs for cost cutting. And my immediate reaction was, I started my career on Wall Street, and I know how that works. In finance, there's this thing called IBG, YBG. And if you're not familiar with the term, there's a great definition over at Urban Dictionary, always one of my favorite sources. It's I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Because Wall Street is a bonus culture. You get your bonus in January based on what you accomplished in the prior year. And then you quit on January 31st and start working for your competitor on February 1st. That's standard there. And it's really bad because, yes, sometimes it does make personal sense for you to blow up the global economy. I edited this entry a little bit. In the past, I've been told my language is too harsh. Sorry, I'm from New York. The point being, we can all think of bad things to do if there's money attached. If you're going to get a bonus and you know you're not going to be there long, do you really care how good the backup strategy is or how resilient the company is going to be against a one in every few years type of outage? If there's enough money out there, maybe not. I'm good friends with the people at the Duckbill Group, Corey Quinn and others, who are one of the top AWS cost consultancies. They won't take jobs on a pay, percentage of savings basis. And Corey has basically told me straight out, if I ever do that, it has to be the last job I ever do, because I know I'm going to be tempted to give them some advice that will ruin my career. If you want a commission, get a sales job. Rewards programs are not the way to approach things. And with that, I'm wrapping up my anti-patterns, but I did promise a few things that you could do right now. And this gets into the space of productivity, which is more aligned to the people side of the cost equation. Remember, I said every metric is dollars per something, and dollars per whatever people do is what we call productivity. And it's been discussed a lot this past year. I bring it up in a cost discussion because go back to the million cats story. Your management may say, we want costs down, we want costs down, but deliver more for the same money, they'll be pretty happy too. So think about that. There have been lots of new productivity metrics and frameworks. Most of them are at least partly wrong. Some of them are, almost all of them have some useful information in them, so they're worth looking at and understanding. Except the one from McKinsey. Please, if it comes from McKinsey, you can treat it as if it came out of Oracle. But there are things you can do about productivity right now. In my last role at AWS, I was literally killed by meetings and by a manager who thought the answer to everything was another big meeting, which would completely trash everybody's schedule. One of my colleagues, who is also no longer there as of this past week, told me at the time, if you think a big standing meeting is the answer, you haven't asked the right question. And I agree with that. Kaz at Shopify, who I'll talk about in a minute, wrote earlier this year that, meetings are a bug, not a feature. Again, I agree. There's been a lot of discussion of this. I've seen articles going back 10 years about how to slowly move towards doing better. I'm increasingly aligned with what Shopify did earlier this year, where they just canceled them all and claim it's probably early to make such a claim, but they claim a 25% increase in velocity of stuff delivered. I suspect that'll trend down, that was an initial pop, but clearly there's an impact there. Their attitude was, we're just going to cancel all standing meetings. If they're really important, people will recreate them, and set some pretty tight guidelines for why should you have meetings. Well, most of us are not in a position to do that for our entire companies, but we can, within our teams, within our organizations, set norms around attending and not attending. For example, in the team I used to run, my rule was no engineer needs to be part of more than one regular stand-up. You attend the stand-up for your team. Occasionally, there will be a situation where maybe you have to contribute something to another team, and you will incidentally go to another stand-up. Fair enough, but it should not be a regular part of your schedule. And by regular, I mean if you're doing it more than once a week, or if you're doing it as much as once a week, it's too much. And I basically told people, decline all meetings unless you understand what you are there to contribute. And I think that's really important, because if you're not there to contribute, you can read the notes later. Meetings like the ones a former manager of mine liked, what he called alignment meetings, which was basically just me talking, him then correcting me, and everybody else taking notes, are just a true waste of everybody's time, and they hurt productivity for reasons I'll get to in the next slide. But some of you know about them. And set norms for scheduling standing meetings. There are certain meetings I will schedule out for a year, monthly reviews, for example. But most project meetings, I'll schedule out a couple months. I don't know what the project is going to look like more than 2 months out. If you do, either you're lying to yourself or you are in a really rare situation. And if you need to discuss this with your management, use data to quantify the costs. Shopify says average cost for an employee prior to their change, average cost per employee was something like $25,000 US, or maybe it was Canadian. No, Shopify or Toronto. So 25,000 Canadian per year per employee spent on meetings. That's a lot. Number two thing you can focus on right now that addresses productivity, that does not require a complex framework, is attention killers. I won't read through the slides, but working in blocks of effectively less than half an hour is worthless. And if you read Paul Graham, and I really recommend this article, for most engineers and developers, blocks of less than half a day are not really optimal. And the sad reality is most knowledge workers today rarely get as much as an hour of uninterrupted focus time. I think this is one of the things that initially got really good during the pandemic, when we were all at home and had focus, and I think got worse and has become even worse with return to office, as we started proliferating all sorts of tools to disrupt ourselves. Things you can do right now: turn off all notifications and tell your team to as well. I'm not sure what the settings are for corporate versions of some of the messaging service applications we all use, but if you can get notifications turned off globally, do it. Set norms on when it's okay to interrupt somebody. And as I said, think of maker time in half days and schedule accordingly. Won't repeat what Paul Graham said. Read it for yourselves. He said it far better than I ever will. And if you want to know where some of this data comes from, it comes from the book Stolen Focus. Again, a good read. And your worst enemy. Yes, I talked about tools a minute ago, but I've come around to this viewpoint. The Atlantic wrote about it. Slack basically at this point doesn't exist to improve your productivity or to help you work. Slack exists to promote Slack. It is, as the Atlantic said, basically Facebook now. It exists to try to draw you in, to get you into more organizations, more groups. They get paid because people are using it, and they've decided to really lean into that. You have to intentionally try to lean out. What to do about it? Again, turn off notifications, limit the number of organizations on your work device. This group has a great channel that I participate in, but when I was at AWS, I didn't have the Vancouver Software Development Managers on my work device that I was using during the day. I have it here. I have it on my personal device. I have about 10 other organizations on my personal devices, but I made the effort to not let them interrupt my work. Discourage non-work channels. This was another thing, not Spotify, Shopify. I need to correct that. When they deleted all meetings, they also deleted most of the Slack groups and channels. Again, their answer was, if people really need them, they'll create them again. In my old organization, yeah, there was a cat pics channel, but it really was a waste of time. And it was one of those channels that almost by design made you want to have notifications on, because I'd have these contests, pet the cat, jump in right this second, first 10 people. That's a horrible thing to do at the office. It was tons of fun, but I hate to think about how much time and money that cost at Amazon scale. And do not use Slack as an archive. That's not what it's for. Archive your documents, archive other information. So that's frankly, so that you can delete those old groups and chats and everything else that always seem to pop up at the worst possible moment. That's mostly what I have to say right now. And these are my two friends. This might not exist without them, or at the very least, I'd be a lot sadder. So now I'll take questions, and there are a few appendices to this presentation. Mostly it's links to some of the sources for the information I presented. I will post a link into the meetup group, and you're free to look at those there. Now I will quit my screen share, and I'm open to questions. Sorry I wasn't able to during. Oh, optimizing. Let me take a look through the chat, since that was hard to do while I was presenting. What is the best combination of vendors, tools, solutions, and methodologies to manage and optimize cloud costs?
Whatever works for you in the moment.
Honestly, that's the truth. Everybody is still, this is really a new space. Keep in mind, I have been at AWS for quite a while, so we didn't get to use outside tools. My primary tool was a spreadsheet. By the way, I know a lot of other companies whose primary tool is a spreadsheet. What's that? Hello? Somebody said something. Okay.
Yeah, just noise.
But
I can share with folks what I do.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear.
I'm an engineering program manager. I work at Sonatype. You can see the name across there. If you don't know who
Yep.
that is, Google them. Maven Central for starters.
Yep.
Um, so we have something to the tune of 65 or 66 AWS accounts at the moment, including the master payer account, and everything's organized into an organization.
Yeah.
Um, the accounts are broken up on either for development on a team basis or on a service or software delivery, broken up by the service that's being delivered.
Hmm.
Um, and our mainstay product is IQ. It's a software composition analysis tool. And there's a sister service that goes with it, which we call the hosted data service, or HDS. It's all about data identity. Um, I report to finance and to product management every month a breakdown of how the AWS cost breakdown based on either SKU or business segment or product segment. Um, we have I will say that we have tagging, but our tagging is inconsistent and in a state of incredibly poor hygiene, because teams are kind of allowed to do whatever they want, even though we've got sort of a tagging standard. They pick on that. And as many of you may know, in Cost Explorer, uppercase and lowercase are not the same. So,
Hmm.
some people use spaces, some people use underscores, some people use hyphens. So, so that doesn't work out so well. You can't do data transformation in Cost Explorer and in your billing. So, there's been a need for a while to make use of a third-party tool. And something that's happened recently is we've launched a SaaS version of IQ. So it's a multi-tenant IQ in the cloud running in Kubernetes. It's a shared Kubernetes cluster, so there's multiple namespaces, and there are multiple deployments of this Kubernetes cluster for DR and blue-green deployments, and non-production versus production. It's become very, very challenging to sort out and do those breakdowns of costs. Somebody on there has mentioned cube cost. We were using cube cost for a while to get an approximation of, you know, how much a given tenant was utilizing in Kubernetes. I'm just going to come out and say it. Cube cost sucks. It's
I've
it's
heard that before.
its pricing model is wildly inaccurate, so you can't use the pricing model. And the best that you can do is, or at least I've chosen to do, is come up with a percentage-based attribution. You take the total cost, figure out the cost that it's telling you the namespaces are, and come up with a percentage and use the real cost. So right now on a monthly basis, I'm reporting the finance in a spreadsheet, in a Google sheet. It's big, it's ugly, it sucks, and it doesn't inform the account owners or the engineering teams on what they're doing with spend. We also tend to speak in different chunks of languages. We have an enterprise discount program. We've got a compute savings plan. We do reservations on RDS instances. Sometimes we talk in actual cost versus amortized cost, which is amortizing your reservation out over the 12 months, versus your discounted cost if you're pulling in your compute savings plan. Finance, because we've entered the SaaS space, wants to know now. They're to a point where they're at least wanting to know how much, like what is the cost of goods on we call our shared IQ, our SaaS IQ, we call it Mighty IQ. How much does Mighty IQ cost? I can only give them like very general numbers. They're not happy with that. So we've been investigating a tool called Cloud Zero. They're pretty new in the space. And that was actually recommended to us by our AWS TAM. So they're an AWS partner as well. We haven't signed with them yet, so it looks promising. They don't rely on good tagging hygiene, and they can also slice and dice the data, the billing data in different ways. So if anyone has the same challenge that I have, I recommend at least looking at that tool. And for the love of God, don't use KubeCost.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to block you there. My impression of a lot of these tools, and I won't comment on any of them specifically, although I've heard the same thing about KubeCost, is most of them are good for some things, not good for others. So when you ask me what's the best combination of vendors, tools, and so on, my answer is, where is the bulk of your spend? Is it in compute? Is it in Kubernetes cluster? Is it in raw compute? Is it in Kubernetes clusters? Are those shared clusters? That brings up these problems you've been discussing. Is it in data storage? I've seen that a lot. That requires different ways of looking at things, and different competencies in looking at things. Is it in network ingress and egress? Again, which is a space I spent a lot of time in, working in EC2 networking. There are different tools that would help you optimize that. And my feeling is that most of these tools have started from wanting to do one thing and do the one thing reasonably well. But is it the thing that you really need? And I feel like you will go through stages, and at each stage, you're probably going to need more and more sophisticated tools, where your initial stage is, we have no idea what's going on. Your second stage is, we will have good directionality, which is that we will reliably know, are we up, are we down, but you won't have good hard numbers. And beyond that, you will get to a point where you are attributing good hard numbers that everybody can agree on. And very often the politics of what everybody can agree on is where things really get hung up, especially with anything that's shared. Everybody will have a reason why the other person should own the cost of that shared resource, whether it's a cluster or a massive S3 bucket, or I don't want to make this AWS specific, but that seems to be the direction we've gone into. But any other resource you may have out there, everybody thinks it should be owned by somebody else. And very often it's really owned by, as I said during my presentation, a strategic decision that the founder made 10 years ago that everybody is still paying for, even though nobody really cares.
Apathy.
Yeah. Well, not so much apathy as just momentum.
Yeah.
We've always kept all the data, and we've never had a hot, warm, cold data strategy. So we just keep doing it because nobody's thought about it.
Yeah, my favorite one is my favorite one is trying to figure out why our snapshot storage bill, like why snapshot storage is so high, and you go and have a look at people that are taking snapshots twice a day and storing them forever and ever. This is just another example, but yeah, it's the other half of it. So the other half of the equation that I found is and in our breakout room, I was saying to people, I don't ever refer to what I do as about saving costs or cutting costs, but being more efficient with our spend. So I always use spend efficiency. So it's being efficient with the resources that you're using, your approach to your infrastructure. So if you want to take snapshots as part of your backup strategy, you probably should. But you should also ask yourself, how far back in time do you need to go with your snapshots?
Yeah.
Probably not 7 years unless you're the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, but even then, the government says 7 years. Is it 7 years of daily?
Yeah, exactly.
7 years of what? 7 years of weekly, monthly, daily? I mean, I know when I started in financial services, we kept 7 years, but the 7 years we kept was the 7 years monthly.
Okay, yeah, the last
Dailies
one of the month.
we kept for 3 days.
Yeah.
Weeklies we kept for 2 months. You know, these are choices you make.
All right. Sorry, you finish your sentence first.
Go ahead. I was pretty much done.
No, I'm just saying that like it was a really great discussion, and I want to be conscious of the time. So thank you so much for. I wanted to basically wrap up by just saying a big thank you for Michael for doing our last event of the year. Thank you so much for speaking to our events. So let's give him a wrap.
And thank you all very much. This is the first time I've given this presentation. I'm going to be giving it again at the Southern California Linux Expo in March. So if you have any comments, please send them my way. I'll post a link to the slides, which include links to lots of additional reading material in about 5 minutes.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.